So looking at the divided monarchy, we're going to organize it by dynasties in the Northern Kingdom. And this is the first time I've ever done that, so we're going to see how this works. But there were distinctly different dynasties that arise and fall.
Isn't that because what ended up happening is Jeroboam king and so forth?
Kings died, yes. So this week we're looking at Jeroboam's dynasty and the associated kings of Judah at the same time. And then next week will be Baasha's dynasty and the associated kings of Judah. He gets mentioned. You're going to notice that, there's a little bit of a transition from one into the next. Omri's, Jehu's, and after Jehu's dynasty, the northern kingdom becomes very chaotic, and we'll just lump them together after Jehu's dynasty.
Wait, is he after Baasha?
No, he's after Omri. Who's after Baasha.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, what about Zimri?
Yeah, he didn't get a dynasty.
Right.
When you only reign 7 days and you commit suicide,
Wait.
it's a pretty short period.
That's right. Now
Yep.
I remember, right?
All right, so
Was he
in this
removed
time
from
frame.
power first, or
I'm sorry, what?
was he removed from power first? Or?
No, you'll read about it next week, I think, or maybe, shortly you'll be reading about him.
Was it the House of the Forest of Lebanon?
Nope,
Oh, good.
it was in Tirzah. He went out with a bang.
That's one way of putting it.
Okay.
Yes. So Jeroboam rules over the northern kingdom of Israel. His capital city appears to be Tirzah, which is a city in Ephraim. Unfortunately, I don't have Tirzah marked on your map, but it's in the northern part of Ephraim. He has a reign of 22 years, which will take him from 975 to 954. And then his son Nadab reigns 2 years, 954, 953. Now, one thing to remember about the years that these guys reign is that the chroniclers would consider a partial year and equate it to a full year. And so you see this actually play out in the way the days of Jesus being dead are rendered in the New Testament. So Jesus dies on a Friday, he's dead all day Saturday, and he rises on Sunday morning. Now, how long would you describe him being dead for?
1.5 days.
Okay, Micaiah would say 1.5 days. Any other takers?
Wait.
That's it.
Right.
Hmm?
So that's right about it.
Yeah, about 1.5 days. But they say he's dead in the grave for 3 days because he was in the grave on Friday, and he was in the grave on Saturday, and he was in the grave for the start of Sunday. And so they will take a partial day and conclude it as a whole day. Since it was part of 3 days, he was in the grave for 3 days.
There's no minimum to that third day.
Nope.
It's not like a rounding up afternoon.
Yeah, it's not like there's a rounding going on. And so Nadab, to reign 2 years, technically, if you take this to its most extreme, he could have ascended the throne on the last day of the year and been assassinated the first day of the next year, been on the throne for less than 2 days, and be equated to 2 years.
That is depressing.
Honestly, he could be on the throne for less than 12 hours and it can be considered.
Which explains the difference in Jeroboam's reign, because that's the 21-year period.
Yep. Anyway, so sorting these out is really challenging. James Usher did it. And there's one check that you can get from a passage in Ezekiel that talks about, I think Ezekiel had to lay on his side or something for 390 days, 1 day for every year of Judah's folly or something like that. There was a judgment that had a day equated to every single year. And so that allows you to figure out from the beginning, when the kingdom divides, to the end, we have a 390-year period, which actually works out to be 388 plus a part and plus a part. But and so that allows us to get like the whole big scoop. And then in putting them together inside, you realize there's partial years, but they're able to sort them out because you have the two kingdoms, and so gets on the throne in the third year of somebody else's reign. You can figure out how they actually fit together. There's a few other chronologies that are done. And the reason why I had the one where the kingdom divides in the year 975 as calculated by James Ussher is because more commonly known chronology that does awful violence to the scripture passages was done by Edwin Teale, and he has the kingdom dividing in 931. What he did is he took the Assyrian chronology and then tried to smush the Bible into it, and so he has fathers and sons reigning at the same time to make it work. And it turns out that like Hezekiah and Ahaz only had 10 years age difference between father and son. And
Wait, Hezekiah's son was Ahaz?
Ahaz was the father of Hezekiah.
Oh.
And Ahaz was 10 years old when he sired Hezekiah.
Wait, really?
Yes,
Oh,
really.
Okay.
But if you look at Edwin Teale's chronology, Hezekiah is reigning as king before he was even born.
That doesn't
And
work.
so you have those discrepancies and you're like, we need a better solution. Anyway, so working off of Escher's timeline is what we're doing here. And there's a few things like the length of the reigns of kings. Partial years are almost always counted as full years. There are a few occasions when they're not, like Zimri. He reigned 7 days. That's clean cut. There's a couple that only reigned for 3 months. But Jeroboam, the key thing that he did is recorded in 1 Kings 12. He has a cultural phenomena that Israel is accustomed to. Where is everybody supposed to celebrate the Passover?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. Where is everybody supposed to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles?
Jerusalem.
Where is everybody assembled for the Day of Atonement?
Jerusalem.
Does that work for the Northern Kingdom?
No.
That means politically, but he's smart.
Politically, he was a genius, but this definitely crushed him spiritually.
Yup.
So in 1 Kings 12:26, it says, And Jeroboam said in his heart, Now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David, if this people go up to offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem. Then the heart of the people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. So his solution is to set up the golden calves. One up in Dan, and the other on the southern border in Bethel, which is really close to Jerusalem, actually. And it would probably have been on the road that most people would be taking to get down to Jerusalem. So he was able to intercept any migrants on their way down there. He creates a new festival on the 15th day of the 8th month, which is different from the 15th day of the 7th month, which I believe is when the Feast of Tabernacles was to be celebrated. Now, in the days of the judges, what happened up in Dan?
Someone invaded it?
Yes, somebody invaded Dan. Any details? This is one of those obscure stories at the end of the book of Judges. I don't think I actually had you read it.
Oh dear.
Well, that means I read it anyway because it was old Judges.
Okay? Do you remember what happened in Judges? Yeah.
Well, there was the slide implies that there's something with false worship.
Right.
Was that the guy who, the one story about a false priest or whatever,
Yep, false priest.
Yep, he sets up like this, like, idol in his house, and then he gets a Levite to perform as a priest,
Yep.
and then, the men of Dan were going to get more land,
Yep.
and then they come to this house, steal the idol and the priest, and then they go on their way, and then the idol is worshipped throughout all Dan,
Yep.
or something like that.
Yep.
Is that right?
That's the story.
That rings a bell.
Wow.
Ringing any bells?
Good job.
Yeah, this one's obscure. Gideon and Samson are a lot more memorable from the book of Judges. So that priest that they absconded with was actually a grandson of Moses,
Oh my god.
which is funny because they don't introduce that until the very last sentence of the story.
That's just.
They don't. Yeah, they just have
How
this
the great have fallen.
Levite, exactly. How the great have fallen, precisely. And so that was something that happened in the days of the judges, and they set up this false worship up there, and Jeroboam clings to it and sends a calf god up there. Is like, will really solidify Dan as a center of false worship up here. And then Bethel's the place in the south. He introduces the new festival, and this is his way to try to secure his power and his position, which is interesting because he essentially did not believe the word of the Lord that was spoken to him through Ahijah the prophet, because Ahijah the prophet said, if you serve the Lord, he'll establish a household and a dynasty for you for all time. That does not come about at all. And he walks right away from the Lord and institutes this new worship, and then the Lord sends him a message later in his reign that his household will be utterly destroyed to a person. This triggers a really significant reaction, though, amongst the northern tribes. And this is found in the 2 Chronicles account. Chapter 11, verses 13, 14, and then 16. When all the Israelites in the north see this, it says, and the priests and the Levites who were in all Israel presented themselves to him and from all the places from where they lived, for the Levites left their common lands, their holdings, and came to Judah and Jerusalem because Jeroboam and his sons cast them out from serving as the priests of the Lord. So they were reporting to Rehoboam in the south. And then it continues in verse 16, those who had set their hearts to seek the Lord God of Israel came after them from all the tribes of Israel to Jerusalem to sacrifice to the Lord, the God of their fathers. So you have this massive sifting and sorting that takes place because of this calf worship that Jeroboam introduces. So Judah starts off as just Judah. Benjamin rapidly moves over into that camp. Simeon geographically is stuck in that camp. The entire tribe of the Levites, they abandon their inheritance and they move down. And so now you're up to 4 tribes, and then you've got representatives from all the rest of the tribes. The ones who are truly following God move south and just move into Judah. So it's a real amalgamation, and we'll track a couple more migrations that take place here. But Judah ended up being like the, what's the word to look for? A kingdom of the more devout. And the northern kingdom is those who are willing to tolerate worshiping the calf gods.
Seems like there's a lot of separation between the tribes. That
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right, so one of the key stories from Jeroboam's reign, as he's starting to offer sacrifices at Bethel, is when this man of God from Judah, who is not named, we don't know who he was, comes and confronts him. And he prophesies that a Josiah will arise in the house of David and will burn human bones on the altar that he set up in Bethel to defile it. Because remember, you don't offer a pig as a sacrifice, and you can't offer anything that touches a human or a dead body is unclean. And so this was a sign that was going to be Bethel would be desecrated as a place of worship. And then there's 2 signs that accompany the message that day. One is that Jeroboam's hand shrivels up when he gives the command to seize the man of God. And then secondly, the altar splits apart and all the ashes pour out.
I wonder if there's something significant about ashes pouring out to an altar.
Yes.
It is.
I cannot imagine going like this and then not being able to withdraw my arm. It was quite terrifying. He lived a few more days. His return trip was marred by getting mauled by lions because he disobeyed after being led astray.
Why is
The man of
everyone
God?
who's like
Mm-hmm.
does awesome things always have their pitfalls and they do something dumb? Like, it's so disappointing. It's like
Remember that in life.
I'll try.
All right. So sometime after this, Jeroboam's son gets sick. And this is an interesting occurrence where sometimes God sorts the righteous out from the wicked by killing the righteous or allowing them to die.
Peacefully.
Peacefully, exactly.
Rather peaceful.
So Jeroboam has one son whom God deems as being good, and he allows him to die and be mourned and buried and have a standard funeral. He's as a sign of honor. Whereas everyone else of Jeroboam's household is going to die a very dishonorable way, and their bodies will be eaten by animals. Eaten by the dogs if they die in the city, eaten by the birds of the field if they die out in the countryside. And that was a very stark warning that came through Ahijah the prophet at Shiloh. And Jeroboam sent his wife in disguise, which is really ironic because Ahijah is actually already blind. How do you wear a disguise for a blind person?
Really fears the.
Yes.
Well, I suppose like if the servants are like if Ahijah's servants are like, look, it's the wife of so and so, or like I imagine a king's wife going to south into a different country would attract some noise.
Shiloh is in the north. It's in Ephraim.
Never mind.
Do you remember what else was at Shiloh in days past?
Greg is such
The
a
Ark
ball.
of the Covenant?
Yeah, that's where the tabernacle had been set up in the days of Joshua. All the way through Eli, the Ark of the Covenant was in Shiloh with the tabernacle.
Isn't that where what's his name also went very frequently?
I'm not sure. Samuel?
Yeah.
Maybe. Alright, so the judgment against Jeroboam's house does not happen in his day. It happens in the days of his son Nadab. It's hard to do this in a linear fashion, but there's a huge battle between Jeroboam and Abijah, the king of Judah. And I'll reference that here after a little bit. But Jeroboam suffers a very large defeat, and that happens just a handful of years before Nadab takes the throne, which I suspect disgruntled the troops just a little bit. Losing 500,000 men in a single day is not usually good for...
Does that happen to any nation ever?
I don't know.
The Russians?
I don't know if the Russians have ever lost 500,000 men in a day. But anyway, so Nadab's claim to fame is that he continues in the sins of his father Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which is a euphemism for he continues the golden calf worship in Bethel and Dan. And he gets assassinated while he was besieging Gibbethon of the Philistines. Very short reign, no significant events going on, but there is a war happening between the northern kingdom and the Philistines. The Philistines had been subdued under Judah. I suspect they were looking at getting some independence, perhaps. So Baasha then sets himself up as king. We'll look at him more next week. He was a general in the army and executed or assassinated Nadab.
It's interesting to me that this image of the calf keeps coming up, or a bull, or Baal, 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 and then even today, in some of the darker occult, it's still there. So I mean, that's an amazing. I mean, you can't tie it to anything but Satan. That's longevity. That's startling. I know God wins in the end. Thank goodness.
All right. So we shift our focus down to the south. The line of David ruling the kingdom of Judah in the south. In this time frame, well, during the reign of Jeroboam, we have two kings in the south, Rehoboam and Abijah. And the third one is Asa. And Jeroboam is still on the throne, I believe, when Asa ascends to the throne. So their capital remains Jerusalem. Rehoboam reigned 17 years. He was king at the age of 41. Does anybody remember how long Solomon reigned?
40 years.
So who was still alive when he was born? Yes, David was still alive. He was an infant when David was 70.
That theoretically means she was blessed by David, though.
Mm-hmm.
That's just crazy. I never thought any of these things overlapped, and they all overlap.
There's a lot of overlap going on, yep. Now his son Abijah, we don't know how old he was when he reigned, but he was 3 years on the throne, and he had 14 sons. So he had a little bit of time there. We don't know why he dies. But in the south, we see Judah gets humbled really far, really fast. So you go from Solomon, who builds up Jerusalem, builds the temple, walled cities all over the place, has a full 12 tribes, and he's got tribute coming from the Euphrates River all the way up in the north, and all the neighboring peoples like the Moabites and the Edomites and so forth. And then suddenly, when Rehoboam takes the throne, they're whittled down to just a handful of tribes. There's some sorting going on. And then, because they engage in worshiping false gods as well, just 4 or 5 years into his reign, they have to suffer a humiliating defeat at the hands of Shishak of Egypt. So in Judah, they're worshiping Asherah poles, and one of the comments made to describe how far they had fallen and how bad it was, the writer says there were even male shrine prostitutes in the land. That was a practice of the Canaanites before them. So Shishak attacks, and this is in 971 BC. Solomon's only been in the grave for 4 years, and he has a very large army and carries off an awful lot of the treasure that had been accumulated. So remember all the talents of gold that Solomon was getting every year. It goes down to Egypt. And Solomon had made 50 golden shields. After they get taken off down to Egypt, Rehoboam replaces them with bronze, which is much less valuable, much more common, and it's just a fraction of the value that once was there.
Wouldn't that have more functionality?
But they were ceremonial. Yeah, it was just a display, so you're right, it would be a lot more functionality, but I think when they went into war, they probably used iron shields more likely.
Yeah.
So, no, Solomon had golden shields made just to look really fancy. Ostentatious display of wealth. With Rehoboam, you see one of the things that happens, though, is that he and the rest of the leaders of Judah humble themselves. And this comes across specifically in the Chronicles version. And so the Lord doesn't completely destroy Judah at this point in time. He lets them continue on. So Rehoboam only reigned 17 years, and then we have his son on the throne. And the king's account is very brief, but the Chronicles account has one really good event that takes place. The background is that there was war constantly going on between the house of Rehoboam and Jeroboam, trying to sort out where that boundary is, because Tirzah, the capital of the northern kingdom, and Jerusalem are very close to each other, relatively speaking. And
so it's like the North and the South in the Civil War?
yeah, much like the North and the South in the Civil War, where Richmond and Washington, D.C. are a stone's throw away from each other. And that's where all the armies are fighting. And so in the Abijah's day, the war breaks out. Israel assembles 800,000 men, and Judah assembles 400,000 men. The northern kingdom tries to catch them in an ambush by sending a force around behind them. And one of the things that was always a huge disadvantage in battle is having to fight on two sides at the same time, because usually you try to have all your spears, all your swords aimed in the same direction. And so In a few battles, this is one of them. The Lord delivers one of the armies that is being attacked from two sides. It happened in David's reign once with Joab commanding the army.
Wasn't it Joab and Abner?
Joab and his brother
Or not
Abishai.
Abner,
Yep. But anyway, so this is a brutal defeat for the North because they lose 500,000 men in a single battle,
That's terrible.
which is something that's really hard for us to comprehend in this day and age. But they tended to have really large set piece battles that were on all or a high stakes, all or none victory. So one of the things about ancient armor is that you were always protected in the front, but you weren't protected in the back. And if everybody around you turns around, then your back is exposed and you can get cut down really quickly.
And I know you're gonna know this, you're the perfect guy to
Maybe,
ask.
but
So, based on what you just said,
Mhm.
and the vulnerability of being attacked from the back, especially with all your weapons. So, at some point in the Bible, because there's an end time connection to this, there's one of the plagues has a stinger like a scorpion, and that can attack, and it can attack from the front as well. But eventually, the warfare would be set up so, like you, let's say you and I were in battle together, and Micaiah and Matthew were with us. Well, eventually, because of what you just described, Micaiah and I would be facing this way, and then Matthew and you would be facing that way. So anyone essentially that's attacking from the front or back would be protected. And there's a point in history when they switched to that kind of warfare. So my question to you is it coming about at this time, or is it, I know you studied it, I'm just trying to.
Well, any army can get their forces turned around. It's just then you have half as many men fighting in any given direction. And so you have to run the risk of getting surrounded and not having any line of retreat that you can, safely and orderly retreat. But then you just have, fewer people that are engaged in one direction or the other. So even today, like the Ukrainian and Russian conflict, they had tried to keep a very defined line. And when the Russians lost a whole bunch of territory this last fall in a Ukrainian advance, it's because the Ukrainians got behind them and cut off all their lines of supplies and food and ammunition. And the Russians were aimed this way, and the Ukrainians were behind them, attacking them from that direction. So
I see. So it doesn't matter.
it doesn't matter. I mean, a tank can, swivel a whole 360 degrees, but you still have to have your forces, they can only really focus in one direction. And if you have to focus in two directions, you need twice as many men to really cover it. So if you have to deal with an attack from two directions, it's very challenging. But it can work, and it did work in this time. So this is the costliest battle recorded in all of the Bible, though. There's lots and lots of body counts that are laid out. This one is the highest one. So that is a unique feature of it. The sad thing is that it was a civil war between Israel and Judah, especially. All right. Does anybody notice differences between the Chronicles account and the King's account? There's some spelling differences, and some versions try to reconcile them together. I think the NIV typically does that, and I noticed the ESV does not. So Abijah, the son of Rehoboam, is Abijam in one account and Abijah in another account. So what do you think about that?
It's just another thing to confuse us.
They didn't have a spell check back then. Yeah, they didn't have Google.
Beginning of a changing of dialect?
No, not really.
Do you reckon one was written like more like when he was like all fresh, and another one was written a little bit later on, and so like minor details could have been changed, like the last letter of the name?
Yeah,
Or a
nickname
nickname.
is going to be a possibility. Like, a lot of people have multiple names in history and historical accounts, and this is just an example of it. This isn't something that would point towards the Bible being, what's the word I'm looking for? unreliable. This actually supports its authenticity and reliability, because something that's got minor discrepancies, like spellings, usually points towards the people who are writing this were not colluding together and conspiring together. They were writing from what they knew and got it generally correct. Both of these mean just slightly different things, I believe. Abijam, yeah, I'm not actually positive on that. I'll have to look into that.
It's kind of like where their names change. So like Simon Peter or Jacob to Israel.
Yeah, some of those things happen too, as a person acquires another name during the course of their life. So that would be probably with the case with Uzziah. This is later in the kingdom of Judah. There's a king that's a big deal is made about him in the Chronicles account, Uzziah, and he reigns 52 years, I believe. And in the king's account, you have this short little description of a king by the name of Azariah who reigns 52 years, and nothing of significance is mentioned about him. And that's the same king, but it's two very different names.
Happened in this reign? Is it like
You'll have to read about it when we get there in a few weeks. Can't give you that big of a preview.
just like a taste, little nugget?
He invents siege works and counter siege
He's
works.
that guy?
He's that guy, yes.
Yes.
So then the other thing that I notice is very different between the two accounts is the writer of the Kings is a very black and white judge, and the author of the Chronicles is a lot more nuanced in the way he presents kings. This is particularly the case with the kings of Judah, and so there's not much redeeming shown about Rehoboam in the king's account. He loses most of the tribes, and then he gets defeated by Shishak and humiliated, and then he dies, and that's all the writer of the king's account wants to put in there. The writer of the Chronicles account mentions that he and the leaders of Judah humbled themselves in the process of this. And that's a significant thing, because kings humbling themselves usually mean that they survive, they're not judged, it's postponed for a few generations at the very least. And so
And theoretically, they can go what? Or whatever.
getting to live longer and not being under the judgment of God is usually just a good thing.
Right.
And one of the other big differences between the Chronicles and the King's account, though, is that the Chronicles account doesn't really talk anything about the northern kingdom. It'll get referenced on occasion as necessary to make something make sense in the south when they interact with each other, but he's not trying to give a chronicle of all the kings of Israel. He's just trying to give you an account of the history of the kings of Judah. He's essentially written off the north. It's not even worthy of mention.
That's a Dixie biased account.
A very Dixie biased account. There you go. The south is where it's at.
Are the northern kings worthy of mention?
They get a lot of mention in the King's account. And actually a lot of the prophets of the Old Testament that we remember the most land in the north. Like one of the big, huge digressions that the author of the Kings takes is talking about Elijah and Elisha. I don't know if they even get mentioned in the Chronicles, but they were prophets that prophesied in the north. They didn't prophesy in the south.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
they hardly interact with the
that's
southern
right,
kings at all.
'cause
Oh my
Elijah went through the southern kingdom to get to Horeb.
Yep.
Whoa.
And so, yeah, they take up a very prominent section of the narrative in the King's account, to the point where you think that that's what the author wanted to highlight in its entirety, and they don't even get hardly mentioned at all, if at all, in the Chronicles account.
Were
So-
there any big were there any big prophets in the south?
Isaiah, he's a big prophet.
Oh, he was in the
Jeremiah,
south?
mhm.
Oh,
Ezekiel, Daniel,
so lots of them.
lots of them.
Oh.
Just not early in the period. Most of the minor prophets and major prophets that wrote books that were preserved came later. So I think on the timeline, I put a darker, bolder outline if the prophet wrote a book.
Yeah.
And if they did not write a book, then they're much lighter. So you can discern between
dotted.
prophets who, some of them are dotted, some of them aren't. Elijah and Elisha are not dotted. The dotted just implies that we don't know when they started prophesying and when they stopped, but it was roughly in that time frame corresponding to the kings and such. quite a few of them did write things down because that was the source material for the writer of the Chronicles, but the writings are not extant, so we don't know. But then later you'll find quite a few of the prophets wrote books that are still around, and we'll cover them when we get to them. All right, any questions about the early days of the divided kingdom?
No, but Micaiah gets an A for his commentary tonight. Spot on in about 10 different things.
Yeah, I'd give it a B plus.
So is the timeline large enough? I was thinking of making a slightly larger format version of it.
You know, you can make a larger version of it and then get like an easel and put it on the easel, or use Alex's easel. Like that could work, because then you can like point at it and whatnot. But I don't. It's a good size for what we have, at least in my opinion.
Okay.
And then you can get like one of those like foldable stick things, so you can like point to it and be all professional.
This has got to be like the smallest font that's readable though. It's pretty tiny.
So we have to move essentially 1,200 years before we start going back to a single kingdom, or have I got that wrong?
I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Well, you clearly have a northern, we're just now learning.
Yep, northern and southern.
And it looks like, unless I'm, like you said, you might,
The northern kingdom gets destroyed in approximately 722, I think.
that would make sense.
You end up with a single kingdom after that because there is no northern kingdom left.
All right.
Wait, what? Like, that land is just occupied by somebody else?
Depopulated by the Assyrians.
So you gotta
Oh.
think the people who are working out the plan to save Benjamin are ticked. All that work in this was gonna disappear anyways?
Yep.
Wait, what?
The end of Judges when Benjamin was gonna die off, the people who came up with the plan to allow them to kidnap the people's daughters. They've gotta be ticked when Benjamin and all the other tribes disappear.
Well, Benjamin doesn't though because they're tied to Judah at this point in time. But a lot of other tribes do disappear. We'll try to look at the ebb and flow of the kingdoms in their territories. And the other thing though to remember is that a lot of representatives from all the northern tribes ended up migrating to the south and absorbing into Judah. And this is where the identity of a Jew comes up, and is that it was somebody who was from that kingdom, not necessarily part of the tribe of Judah.
Why, what was the reason for that departure?
They didn't want to worship the calf gods. So the Levites and the priests had a huge vested interest because their income was tied to the proper worship of God. And when Jeroboam walked away from that and was setting anybody up as a priest or pseudo-Levite, they realized, like, we are not going to have any influence, any income anymore. But they did walk away from their fields and their pastures and their homes, and they decided, like, we're going to stick with the true worship because we're not going to deal with this false worship. So it was pretty deeply instilled in them for them to stand up and be willing to sacrifice that much.
Give up everything.
Give up everything, exactly. Move to the south, where they did not have anything. So there was quite the sorting going on. And then there's a couple more times we're going to find where the people from the north move south again. The days of Hezekiah and Josiah, I think, but we'll look into that later. So, all right. Well, we'll end just a little bit early. As you're reading through the readings, I suggest you have your timeline out because the writers, especially the writer of the Kings, will jump from one kingdom to the next kingdom, and it's really hard to keep it straight. And you can if you visually have the timeline to see like this guy's reigning and this guy becomes king and this guy becomes king and so forth, you'll be able to follow along. It is not quite as linear as it looks like.
Yeah, I think we got kind of babied by earlier readings in Samuel and Kings and such, where one hero comes, falls or divides or.
Yep. Yeah, the narrative is a lot more complicated now.
Great,
So-
that's what I need, more complex.
More complexity, yes. That's why I generate the graphics to introduce a little simplicity.
Thanks, Pastor.
All right.
Appreciate it.